Want to welcome everyone this evening to Wetland Portrayal in Modern Films. This is the third and final installment in our Wilderness Wednesday. I have these co-sponsored with the Kankakee Valley Forest Preserve District, and we do a series of natural resource based speakers in August and then again in January or yeah, January, and then we'll do another set in August. It seems like those are the 2 months that people want to be in. August is hot and January is so cold, and especially the last 2 days I thought were good evenings to be home doing a Zoom. What will happen is we will have the speaker. If you have questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat, and Jeff Matthews will try and answer them as they come. And if we miss it at the end, we'll have a question and answer series session. These will be taped, and we will send out a recording at a later date for you to have a chance to listen to them or to tell friends that could have missed tonight's presentation. So let me just tell you a little bit more about our speaker tonight. Dr. Jeff Matthews is an associate professor in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Science at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Matthews conducts field experiments and observational studies on plant communities in both natural and restored ecosystems to identify the factors driving changes in ecology communities. He teaches courses in wetland ecology and management, native plant identification, and plant ecosystems. Tonight, we are going to analyze the portrayal of wetlands in modern films. And after viewing 163 films that included swamps, bogs, and other types of wetlands, we evaluated how filmmakers have used the wetlands as storytelling devices, potentially shaping viewers' perception. Wetlands are predominantly portrayed negatively in films, often as trials and tribulations of the protagonists. Such portrayals have influenced wetland conservation by perpetuating negative attitudes about those important ecosystems. So, without further, I want to invite everyone to just sit back and listen, and we're all going to learn a little bit more about the wetlands. So, I'll just let you have the screen, and I will you have all you have 45 plus minutes to tell us a little bit about wetlands in film.
Thank you, Holly. Can you see my screen okay?
I can.
Okay, great. And thank you for inviting me here to speak to everyone today. Thank you all for attending. And so I'll be talking about a project that we worked on to determine how wetlands are portrayed on screen in films. And my collaborators on this project were Jack Zenin, who had the initial idea for the project and led the work. Jack Zenin is a wetland ecologist at the Illinois Natural History Survey. We also worked with Brian Charles at the Illinois Natural History Survey and Chris Wilhelm at the College of Coastal Georgia. So I'll start with a little bit of background on wetlands themselves. Wetlands have been defined variously for different purposes, but most scientific definitions of wetlands kind of revolve around three key features. And those are wetland hydrology, or the presence of water within the root zone, above the surface, or at least near the surface of the soil for at least some portion of the growing season, so that plant roots are wet. The second key feature is the presence of hydric soils, and these are characterized by soil conditions that differ from those in soils that develop in drier upland settings. And some of those hydric soil features are visible, and you can see that in this image of the soil core in the middle figure here. And the third is hydrophytic vegetation or hydrophytic biota, wetland plants in particular, but also wetland dependent plants and animals and microbes. These are specialized organisms that are adapted to these wet conditions, and often they have to be adapted to both wet and alternately dry conditions, because often wetlands aren't wet year round, but they may be wet seasonally or just temporarily. There are more than 700 million hectares of wetlands on Earth, covering about 5 to 8% of the Earth's total land surface. And those are distributed worldwide They tend to not be as prevalent in arid regions of the world. But as you can see in this map, there are vast wetlands across the northern latitudes. These are boreal swamps and or boreal bogs and peatlands, tropical swamps, tropical peatlands. We have temperate wetlands across most of the eastern half of the United States, particularly along low-lying areas along the Atlantic coast, the Gulf Coast, floodplain forests along the Mississippi River and other major rivers of the world. Unfortunately, 20 to 50% of the world's original wetland area has been destroyed. Most of the loss of wetlands has been due to conversion to other land uses, particularly agriculture. Other wetlands have been lost due to development, but by far the greatest loss of wetlands has come from conversion to agricultural areas. Wetlands, historically in the Euro-American tradition, were often viewed as wastelands. They presented a physical encumbrance. They were difficult to traverse. They hindered colonization. Being neither land nor water, wetlands were kind of untamable. They were unsuitable for cultivation. You couldn't grow crops because they were too wet. They were also unsuitable for waterborne transportation, unlike a lake or a free-flowing river. They were soggy, uncivilized places, and they were viewed as dangerous. They were the stronghold for large predators and the source of diseases. They were particularly thought to be sources of malaria. The word malaria itself comes from the word bad air. And it was at one time, we now know, of course, that malaria is spread by mosquitoes, but at one time it was thought that it was contracted by inhaling noxious vapors that emanated from rotting vegetation in wetlands. Because wetlands were often remote and difficult to traverse, they were also inhabited by people who were, for one reason or another, shunned by mainstream society. In the southern United States, people escaping enslavement formed maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp or in other southern wetlands. They were also often a stronghold for guerrilla fighters that were waging war against and outmatched against larger, more conventional armies, and they could hide in wetlands and conduct raids far away and difficult to reach by other soldiers. So this general association between people living outside of society's control probably contributed to kind of the general anxiety already associated with wetlands. And not surprisingly, stories developed that reflected these societal impressions of wetlands as dangerous places. For example, parents in England warned children to avoid ponds and wetlands, or the water hag Jenny Greenteeth would reach up and drag them down under the water. And Jenny Greenteeth was associated with the floating plant duckweed. And if you're familiar with duckweed and if you've ever seen a pond covered with duckweed, you can understand the nature of the ambush. Duckweed forms these dense mats on the surface of the water to such an extent that it looks like it might be solid ground that you could step on, only stepping on it to realize that you're suddenly underwater, dragged under by Jenny Greenteeth. Jenny Greenteeth herself is perhaps derived from the marsh monster Grendel from the Anglo-Saxon epic Beowulf. There were other legends about wetlands as well. From Europe and North America, legends would describe will-o'-wisps and jack-o'-lanterns, these mysterious lights that would shine at night and lure travelers off the road at night to become lost in the mires and the bogs. And films are a modern form of storytelling. Monster films in the 1950s and 1960s generally reinforced this anxiety associated with wetlands. We have films like Creature from the Black Lagoon or Curse of the Swamp Creature, Attack of the Giant Leeches, that depicted wetlands as dangerous places that were inhabited by scary monsters. that would hunt, stalk and kill people. So wetlands carry a lot of cultural baggage. We've associated a lot of danger and fear with wetlands throughout the Euro-American tradition. And on the other hand, we now know that wetlands provide numerous benefits to society. They provide their high biodiversity environments. They provide habitat for lots of uh, animals and plants, and they provide numerous benefits to people, including water quality improvement. Wetlands are known as the kidneys of the landscape. They sequester nutrients and pollutants that are running in surface water and collect in wetlands and can either be sequestered, stored in the sediments, or transformed so that it improves water quality downstream. Wetlands are important for flood control. During flooding, wetlands fill up with water, and then they store that water, and then only slowly release it downstream over time. And that has the effect of lessening flood peaks downstream. Wetlands are also really important sites for carbon sequestration and storage, particularly wetlands across the northern boreal ecosystems. They're important spawning areas for fish and shellfish. Coastal wetlands in particular host a lot of commercially harvested species for at least some portion of their lifespan. Fish or shellfish will often move into coastal wetlands to feed or to spawn. And so those wetlands are really important for fisheries. Forested wetlands have been harvested for timber production. And wetlands, of course, provide a lot of recreational opportunities, from observing nature, bird watching, for example, to hunting, particularly waterfowl hunting. And since the 1960s and 1970s, wetlands have been protected in a lot of countries around the world. So wetlands have received protection, and there's this growing recognition of the value of wetlands. So we were interested in whether these values, these increasing positive values associated with wetlands, might be depicted in more modern films. And we analyzed film portrayals of wetlands, first to kind of summarize how wetlands contribute to the film narratives. What role does a wetland scene typically play in a film? So we considered the plot elements, we considered underlying themes that are conveyed about wetlands through film, and wetland characters. And in particular, we were interested in assessing the general attitudes about wetlands that are conveyed through film scenes. Are wetlands generally depicted negatively, positively, or are they just kind of neutral settings within which other characters might interact, or maybe, as you know, the wetland might just be a background essentially, and not be portrayed in a negative or positive light. So our first step in the project was to try to identify films that had wetlands in them. And we happened upon some large data sets of film summaries. The Carnegie Mellon University movie summary corpus, which contained plot summaries of over 40,000 films, and the movie plot synopsis with tags database, which had summaries of almost 15,000 wetlands. So our first step was to try to identify films within those plot summary databases that might contain wetland scenes. We focused on non-documentary films that were released in theaters between 1980 and 2019. So we were excluding films that maybe went straight to video, or films that went straight to TV. And we first searched the plot, the film titles and the plot summaries for a set of 30 wetland related terms. These were terms like bog, swamp, specific wetlands like Everglades, and other terms that we thought might be related to wetlands, like quicksand, for example, was one that showed up a lot. So we searched hundreds of, or tens of thousands of film summaries for wetland related terms, and read those summaries, and finally found 163 films that had true wetland scenes in them. We divided those 163 films among the four researchers, and then watched each film in its entirety, taking detailed notes on any scene that depicted a wetland. And we also completed a pre-established template to record data on the wetland scenes. We were interested in recording how long the wetlands were depicted on screen, what was the runtime of those wetland scenes, what type of wetland was shown, and where in the world was the wetland shown, or was it an entirely fictional location? What was the role of the film in the overall story? Um, what were some of the underlying themes portrayed in the wetland scene? Um, what characters were encountered in a wetland? For example, if the protagonist entered a wetland, who did they meet there? Um, what plants and animals were depicted? We took detailed notes on any plants or animals we could identify. We noted any sounds or music. Sounds included things like rainfall or splashing water or gurgling mud in some of the films. And also the music, what type of music was being played. Was it upbeat? Was it somber? Was it frightening? And then through all of these, try to get a sense of the general attitude conveyed about the wetland: positive, negative, neutral, or maybe some complex mix of both positive and negative. Uh, so I'll start with a kind of a basic summary of some of our findings. The median screen time for wetlands was about 7 minutes in these films. So this equated to about 6.5% of the total runtime of the film, but this really varied widely among the different films. Some films showed wetlands for less than a minute, maybe just in the background. Other films had almost the entirety of the film was set in a wetland. An example of this was one called Gator Bait 2 Cajun Justice, which was set entirely in southern swamps. Commonly portrayed wetlands were forested wetlands, including swamps. These were shown in 66% of the films we viewed, but freshwater marshes were also quite common. Some other types of wetlands that we encountered in film scenes were salt marshes, bogs, mangrove wetlands, rice paddies, aquatic bed wetlands, lakeshore wetlands. And in many cases, the wetlands that were depicted were kind of flat portrayals. They weren't very structurally rich. They maybe didn't show a lot of detail about the wetlands. And we had a kind of joking reference to one type of wetland that we often encountered in some of these films, and we called this the mud hole. And these were often just holes that appeared to have been excavated in an upland setting, filled with water and mud, and then used to represent maybe a quicksand scene or something like that. But we were surprised to find that over a third of the films actually depicted pretty structurally rich and biotically detailed environments, often showing like B-roll of animals in the wetlands to establish the setting. Half of the films, in fact, showed animals, and 2/3 included some sort of animal sounds. And these were either recorded on site or maybe added later to the film during editing. But these were sounds like insect calls, frog calls, bird calls. The most commonly portrayed animals in wetlands and film were alligators. By far, these were overwhelmingly the most common. Alligators seem to be a signifier of wetlands. We also saw a lot of various species of fish and snakes, and a lot of great egrets. Plants in wetlands often received a little less attention as direct shots in the foreground, but maybe were shown as background. Most commonly, we saw cattails, bald cypress trees. Since a lot of the films were set in swamps, bald cypress with hanging Spanish moss was pretty common, and duckweed, of course. Maybe an ode to jetty green teeth there. Film nominal locations of these wetlands were all over the world. We didn't exclusively focus on US films, but just based on the data sets that we were using, most of the films we viewed were US productions. But film locations of the wetland scenes were worldwide, but mostly concentrated in the southeastern United States. And this is an area that's really rich in wetlands. And if you look at the blow up map here, you'll see that there's a high concentration of wetland films that are set in southern Florida and southern Louisiana. So these were pretty common film locations. For about 20% of the films, the wetlands were set in either entirely fictional locations or the location was too vague for us to map. But the names of some of those fictional wetlands really convey, I think, some of the attitudes that were portrayed about wetlands. So a lot of these names have something to do with death, despair, or kind of a general spookiness. Looking at the names of the films, we have the alligator hell, the bog of eternal stench in Labyrinth, the dead marshes in Lord of the Rings, Deadwood Swamp. Swamp of Despondency, the Swamps of Sadness. So you can see a lot of these films are portraying wetlands just through the names alone in a negative light. When movie characters enter a wetland, they're much more likely to encounter antagonistic characters than they are to encounter allies or neutral characters. And in fact, antagonistic characters were found in wetlands in 50% of the films that we viewed. Um, Wetland inhabitants are often strange. Wetlands in films are inhabited by people and creatures that live apart from society in wild places. They might be inhabited by magical characters or creatures, maybe undead ghosts and spirits. Anthropogenic monsters were fairly common, various kinds of grotesque creatures. And one that, although it was only found in a handful of films, we thought it showed up enough that we think it was a kind of an important trope in wetland scenes, and that was the oracle or sage in the wetland. And you may recall in Empire Strikes Back, Luke Skywalker visits the swamps in the Dagobah system to seek out his mentor Yoda as an oracle or a sage. Another example of this is Mama Odie in The Princess and the Frog. The plot elements that were associated with wetlands tended to be related to various difficulties and trials that were encountered by the main protagonists. Most commonly, wetlands are portrayed as physical obstacles that impede travel in some way. A well-known use of wetlands as obstacles in film is Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. In this film, Gollum leads Frodo and Sam across the dead marshes, which they have to cross to reach Mordor. And the dead marshes is inhabited by the undead corpses of old soldiers that sort of lure Frodo off the path and into the water where he has to be rescued. Wetlands are also often the sites of chase scenes and various kinds of conflict. The inundated nature of wetlands might be used by filmmakers to kind of heighten the drama of conflicts and chase, making the chase more difficult just because of the difficulty of moving through water and mud. Wetlands were also places of lurking danger. So the danger in wetlands was often of what we termed the lurking variety. Think of crocodilians waiting just below the surface to ambush prey. The consumption by creatures, including animal and predatory animals or various kinds of monsters, ambush, and potential attack were really common in wetland portrayals. Some of the best examples of this plot trope come from animal monster films like Anaconda, Primeval, Shark Night 3D, where large wetland predators stalk and gradually kill and consume hapless visitors to the wetlands. Other plot elements that we noticed, in a large number of the films, the protagonists intentionally enter the wetland to find some character. This might be an ally, it might be an oracle like Yoda, or it might be some villain. Villains very frequently had hideouts in wetlands, maybe in a rustic shack at the edge of the wetland where they could hide away and hide their nefarious activities. Um, and Wetlands were also often locations of deep emotional tragedy for the protagonist. We frequently found that wetlands were kind of the lowest of the low point for the main characters in the film, where they experience some deep tragedy that is maybe related to the physical difficulty that they're encountering in the wetland itself. Um, and a really good example of this is in The Never Ending Story. And this is a film where the film's hero, a boy named Atreyu, during his epic quest, has to cross a wetland called the Swamps of Sadness. And in the Swamps of Sadness, his horse becomes mired in quicksand and slowly sinks while Atreyu cries and pleads to no avail to try to rescue his horse. And it's a very sad scene, particularly in a film for children. Wetlands were also turned out to be really good places to hide a body. They are a good place to hide a corpse or conceal a crime. So this was often seemed to be the only role of a wetland in a film, was as a place to dump the body. In general, positive plot elements like levity or any kind of conservation related themes were quite rare in these films. Themes associated with wetlands were often related to kind of the extremes of the human experience, and I've already touched on some of those. Or social relationships, maybe the relationships of individuals to society, or most commonly challenges that were faced and overcome by the film's protagonist. But by far, the most common theme that we encountered in wetland films was death. Death was associated with wetlands in these films in 57% of the films that we viewed. And there seems to be some close association between wetlands and death and decay in these common wetland films. In fact, in 36% of the films we viewed, there's a character that's either disposing of a body or encountering a corpse in a wetland. On the other hand, wetlands are also a great refuge. So because of just the physical difficulty of moving through a wetland, because they're uncivilized and remote, maybe distant from cities and towns, they make a good refuge. And in some films, this was like a temporary refuge where maybe the film's protagonist is being chased and they run into the wetland to try to evade capture. In other films, a common theme was the wetland itself is a long-term refuge, maybe from a hostile society. Kind of related to this theme, we often found wetlands associated with the theme of ostracism or outcasts from society. I think the film Shrek is a good example of that, where Shrek lives in his swamp as kind of an outcast, and as opposed to the film's much more civilized antagonist, Lord Farquaad. Other major themes that we found, wetland scenes in films were often associated with some sort of rebirth, a coming of age or a self-actualization of the main characters. So this was often paired with the kind of the low point, the emotional nadir of the characters as they become mired in these wetlands and they face some challenge, some major difficulty, and then their old ways of thinking somehow get dissolved in the wetland, and then they rise up from the muck and they're reborn in some sense, maybe with a new sense of purpose that carries them through the rest of the film. So wetlands often form this pivotal turning point in many of the films. Um, and wetlands were the home of sinisterly supernatural powers. Humanoid monsters, voodoo practitioners were really common, particularly in films set in Louisiana. Um, there were undead creatures, vampires, hostile ghosts, and other apparitions inhabiting these wetlands. Uh, in general, wetlands were portrayed negatively in these films. And in 50% of the films, the wetland was depicted unambiguously negatively. And in another 4.5% of the films, maybe the wetland was shown as positive at first and then became negative as the film developed. This is in contrast to 10% of films where wetlands were portrayed in a positive light, and another 4.5% of films where the initial depiction might have been negative, but the wetland became more positive as the story developed. The negative portrayals uh, largely overwhelmed positive portrayals in modern film. These attitudes varied by genre, however. Drama and animated films in particular depicted wetlands more positively, whereas horror and adventure films, probably not surprisingly, depicted wetlands in a more negative light. So a good example of animated films where the wetlands were initially depicted as sort of negative, either as gross or dangerous, are the animated films Shrek and The Princess and the Frog. And Shrek, the initial depiction of the wetland is kind of, there's a scary ogre that lives there. It's kind of gross and muddy. And in Princess and the Frog, Tiana and Naveen are turned into frogs and accidentally kind of dumped in a wetland where they have to spend the night hiding in a hollow tree stump to try to get away from alligators. And it's depicted as this kind of scary place. But in both of those films, as the film develops, as the audience becomes more familiar with the environment, or as the characters themselves become more familiar with the environment, the portrayals shift to becoming really positive. Wetlands become places of joy. They become places of refuge or resources for the characters, or even places of friendship and romantic love. MPAA rating, decade of release, and box office earnings were generally unrelated to the attitudes portrayed about wetlands. This was surprising to us, particularly for decade of release. We kind of expected that maybe over time between 1980 and 2019, over the course of our study years, the portrayal of wetlands might become more positive, but we found that that wasn't the case. So generally, in conclusion, wetlands carry a lot of socially constructed meanings that get reflected on screen. Um, Scientists define wetlands based on their physical characteristics, the presence of water, the presence of hydric soils, and the presence of wetland vegetation. But wetlands have these other meanings, and those meanings are kind of have a great degree of cultural inertia. And a lot of the same ideas and negative perceptions about wetlands that I mentioned early on in the talk about physical encumbrances to travel or dangerous places get reflected on screen. Films perpetuate a lot of these old tropes and stereotypes. They're obstacles to travel. Most commonly, they present some kind of trial or difficulty for the protagonists. They are places of conflict, of chase scenes, and of sinking, both literally sinking into quicksand, and being engulfed, or metaphorical sinking, an emotional sinking. On the other hand, wetlands were often depicted as a refuge from hostility, either temporary refuge or as a more long-term hideout. And wetlands are depicted as biodiverse and productive ecosystems. We found evidence that wetland portrayals were associated with high biodiversity in a lot of films, even in a lot of the films where, in general, the portrayal was negative. There seems to be this implicit recognition that wetlands are highly productive environments, and they're biodiverse with lots of unique flora and fauna. So I think that storytellers, the filmmakers, utilize um, ideas and preconceptions about natural environments, and then they exaggerate those for dramatic effect. And it's clear that a lot of those creative choices are rooted in this sort of common heritage that we have in our way of thinking about wetlands. Wetlands have been described as landscape sinks. They occur in low-lying positions on the landscape. They're the interface between land and water. They collect all the various water and whatever that water is carrying in these low-lying areas. So they form these landscape sinks, and that's one reason why wetlands are so valuable to people, because they store they sequester nutrients and sediments and store water. But in film, these wetlands become a kind of scapegoat landscape that sequester not only sediments and water, but personal and social anxieties, and dumping our anxiety onto these ecosystems through film. So what are some of the implications of this negative portrayal of wetlands in film? We know that negative attitudes toward wetlands have contributed to wetland destruction in the past. They were seen as wastelands, and therefore there was no reason to protect these areas. The best use for a wetland was thought to be to drain it, to convert it to some other use. And these film depictions, negative film portrayals, might prime audiences' impressions, behaviors regarding wetlands, and at worst might discourage wetland conservation in some way. Unfortunately, these screen depictions are the only way that some people will experience wetlands, and these negative portrayals may perpetuate a kind of biophobia or an aversion to nature in general or to wetlands in particular. So I'll conclude here, but I'd be really happy to take any questions or maybe hear about some of your own impressions about wetlands in film, films that you've seen, or maybe wetlands and how they're depicted in other media.
Jeff, what got you interested in this topic? What made you think of the wetlands in media?
So my collaborators and I had kind of noticed just in films that we'd seen anecdotally, that wetlands were often portrayed in kind of stereotypical ways as places where people are sinking, and they're difficult to cross. They were inhabited by strange creatures that were often dangerous. And Jack Zinnon came across these film summary corpus data sets that had large numbers of plot summaries, and it was really his idea that we could actually analyze this in a more systematic way using those film summary data as starting points. So there's a question in the chat from Dale who asks, where does a work like Creature from the Black Lagoon fit within this study? So Creature from the Black Lagoon is a film from the 1950s. So it was earlier than the start of our study, which was 1980. We focused more on modern films, but a lot of the films from the 1950s and 60s, those kind of same themes of weird, strange monsters lurking about in wetlands are still present in films today. I think if we were to go back and look at films from the 1950s, 1960s, we would probably find that wetland portrayals were even more negative than they are today, but I don't really have the data to show that.
What are you going to do next with the research that you've been doing with the media? What's the next step?
That's a good question. One thing I'd kind of like to explore at some point is really how these negative film portrayals influence people. How does viewing say negative depictions of wetlands in films versus positive depictions of wetlands in films? How does that maybe shift their attitudes about wetland conservation? And I don't have any specific plans to study that, but that's something that I've been interested in. There's a question in the chat. Were there any differences in portrayal between films created and released in the US and in other places where wetlands represent important resources? So this is another good question. We did explore this a little bit, and we didn't find any major differences in attitudes portrayed between US and non-US films. However, our sample size of non-US films was relatively small compared to US films. And this is probably due to some extent that based on the data sources that we use, these were film plot summaries that were written in English, and it's possible that non-US films or non-English films didn't make their way into those summaries, or made their way in such a way as the wetland scenes weren't depicted in the terms that we were using to search. So I don't know that our data set is really equipped to address that question directly. Was this who thought of this topic, or was it a group think around adult beverages? So this isn't that's a good question. Jack thought of this topic. This was Jack Zenon's idea. Jack is a former PhD student of mine. I teach a course in wetland ecology. And during that course, I was kind of in a lecture on an intro lecture on attitudes about wetlands, and I show a few examples of how wetlands are portrayed in film. For example, like Curse of the Swamp Creature um, and Lord of the Rings, and I think that kind of stuck in Jack's mind, and he came across this database of film summaries and had this idea that we could analyze this. So he brought it to the rest of us, and we were all really excited about the idea and ready to jump in.
Anybody else have any? There's been some pretty good questions. How long did I miss the part where you said how long the study took? How long did you do this for?
So it took a long time to watch 163 films, but we did.
I was gonna say I'll sign my husband up to help you because he just loves to watch movies. So I watch about 15 minutes and I'm like, okay, same plot.
Yeah, and I'll say
I
that
wondered how many movies did you really watch to get this much?
we watched 163. Well, actually a few more than that, and it turned out that a couple didn't actually have wetlands in them, so we threw them out. So we probably watched about 165 total, something around there. We did divide them up among the four of us, but I will say that Jack and Brian took more than the other two and watched more. But some of these were really, really bad films.
That's
For
what
So they seemed longer than they were because they were small.
Do you have a list somewhere of all of them that you watched?
Yeah, we published a paper on this. It's in the journal Wetlands. And as part of that paper, we have a list of all the films that we watch, but I'd also be happy to share it with you.
That would
The
be
list.
fun. There, Dale, you were what with your adult beverage, you can sit and watch a good 25 of them this weekend.
Yeah.
Well, if you think of questions that you didn't have a chance to ask tonight, positive image, yeah. She wants some examples of some of the good, positive, images. What were some of them that had good images?
Yeah. About 15% of the films represented sort of unambiguously positive images, and then another handful were more neutral or more complex with a mix of positive and negative. Um, but some good examples of positive images of wetlands in film. I think that the two that I mentioned that really stood out to me were Shrek and The Princess and the Frog. So it's good to see that films that were geared to children are conveying this positive image of wetlands. And there were others as well. I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head. Beatrice at Dinner was one that had kind of conservation related themes. Um, and in general, I didn't mention this in the talk, but in general, films that showed wetlands for longer during the film tended to have more positive portrayals, really focusing on wetlands. Not a huge fan of most of the films studied, I suspect, but the topic is a classic one. Yeah, there were some gems in the films that we watched, and there were some real stinkers. So yeah, I'll share the list with Holly, and maybe she can make that available.